عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah explained that accepted narrations are divided into those which are practiced upon and those which are not practiced upon. So he then explained that if there is a report which has no contradiction, then it will be termed as muhkam. The literal meaning of muhkam means to be firmly solidified. So in the footnotes, Shaykh Nuruddin Itr explained the definition of muhkam, and he said, Al-muhkam al-Ḥadīث alladhī lā yu'āriduhu khabrun wa lā dalīlun ākhar. What is a muhkam narration? That there is no other hadith which contradicts it, and also it does not contradict the Quran or ijma'. Ibn Hajar rahmallah then said, وَأَمْثِلَتُهُ كَثِيرًا, that there are numerous examples of muhkam. Because this here is the normal default, that there are no contradictions. And that clearly shows that majority of the narrations will fall under this category. Majority of the ahadith of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be called muhkam, because ahadith generally comply and seamlessly complement each other. However, there are other narrations which seemingly contradict each other, and Ibn Hajar rahimahullah now discusses this. So he says, وَإِنْ عُورِضَ فَلَا يَخْلُو إِمَّا أَن يَكُونَ مُعَارِضُهُ مَقْبُولًا مِثْلَهُ أَوْ يَكُونَ مَرْدُودًا فالثاني لا أثر له لأن القوي لا يؤثر فيه مخالفة الضعيف وإن كانت المعارضة بمثله فلا يخلو إما أن يمكن الجمع بين مدلوليهما بغير تعسف أو لا فإن أمكن الجمع فهو النوع المسمى مختلف الأحاديث. So he says that sometimes you will find narrations which apparently or seemingly outwardly contradict each other. So we use these kind of terms to say like it apparently contradicts, because in reality there is no contradiction between any of the words or the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was divinely inspired, and all his statements and every action of his was endorsed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if it was inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there cannot be any contradiction, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions with regards to the Quran, He puts out a challenge that if it was from anyone else besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it would have been filled with discrepancies. In verse 82 of Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. That had the Quran been from anyone else besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they would have found numerous discrepancies. They would have found much contradiction in the Quran. So the proof that it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that there is no contradiction. In the same way, Ḥadīth is also from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the 3rd verse of Surah an-Najm, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ, and then in the 1st verse, إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ. So just as there are no contradictions in the Quran because it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the same way there can be no contradictions in the statements and the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because that too is also from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first thing, the first proof to show us that there can be no contradictions between the various statements and the various actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then, no sane person, leave alone a wise person, and Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the wisest of the wise. So no sane person, even a person with little intellect, will utter or carry out things which are contradictory. So if no sane person will do it, then you can imagine how much more far-fetched it will be for someone who is the wisest of the wise. And then also, if a person continuously contradicts himself whenever he talks, he's saying different things, then he will lose all his credibility. No one will follow such a person. So all these prove that there cannot be any real differences in the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But at times, when we see outward contradiction between different reports, then it is either because of one of these reasons, maybe it's because of our lack of knowledge on how these different these different narrations put together. Or maybe we don't understand the real meaning of those reports, and that is why we assume that they are contradictory. Or maybe we are not aware that the one is abrogated, or the one is weak, or it was in a particular context that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam said those words. So this shows that when we come across different narrations which appears to us as if they conflict with each other, then the shortcoming is on our part. It is due to our misunderstanding or our misinterpretation of the different reports that it seems as if they are contradictory. The Prophet ﷺ's words and his actions were all perfect and flawless. So the more one studies a hadith and get experience in this field, the more he will understand that there are absolutely no contradictions. Hence Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, and you know how much he studied, what a great master in hadith he was. Therefore he said, وَلَمْ نَجِدْ عَنْهُ شَيْئًا مُخْتَلِفًا فَكَشَفْنَاهُ إِلَّا وَجَدْنَا لَهُ وَجْهًا يَحْتَمِلُ بِهِ أَلَّا يَكُونَ مُخْتَلِفًا وَيَكُونَ دَاخِلًا فِي الْوُجُوهِ الَّتِي وَصَفْتُ لَكَ. He mentions this here in Ar-Risala on page 216. And then he said, وَلَمْ نَجِدْ عَنْهُ حَدِيثَيْنِ مُخْتَلِفَيْنِ إِلَّا وَلَهُمَا مَخْرَجٌ. That we don't find any ahadith which seemingly contradict each other, except that we found a way of interpreting it. أو على أحدهما دلالة بأحد ما وصفته إما بموافقة كتاب أو غيره من سنته أو بعض الدلائل. And then Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah even wrote an entire book proving how ostensibly inconsistent narrations can be reconciled, and we'll discuss more about that on the next page when Ibn Hajar rahimahullah talks about it. وَقَدْ صَنَّفَ فِي هَذَا النَّوْعِ الشَّافِعِي كِتَابَ اخْتِلَافِ الْحَدِيثِ. So we'll discuss about his book there. Likewise, Alama Khatib rahimahullah also narrates from Ibn Khuzaymah. He said, حدثت عن أبي أحمد محمد بن إسحاق النيزابوري الحافظ قال سمعت أبا بكر محمد بن إسحاق بن خزيمة يقول لا أعرف أنه روي عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حديثان بإسنادين صحيحين متضادان. You see, I don't know. Now, who's talking here? A hafiz of hadith, Ibn Khuzaymah rahimahullah. You know how great his status was. He's saying, I don't know of any two ahadith which are authentic and they contradict each other. فَمَنْ كَانَ عِنْدَهُ فَلْيَأْتِ بِهِ حَتَّى أُؤَلِّفَ بَيْنَهُمَا. If anyone thinks that there are any narrations which are not in conformity with each other, then let him bring it to me and I will prove to him how they complement each other and they do not contradict each other. Yes, there were times when the Prophet ﷺ purposefully done an action in different ways, or said something to one person different, gave a ruling to one person differently to what he gave to others. And that was just to show a permissibility. So you have to also look at the context. But even though the weakness is on our part, it is really important to focus on these type of narrations. Why? Because it could lead a person to lose trust in the Prophet ﷺ. And we know the Orientalists and the enemies of Islam, they magnified these reports and they tried to confuse the general Muslims. So Mullah Ali Qari rahmallah says, هو من أهم الأنواع يضطر إليه جميع الطوائف من العلماء. He's saying that this here is one of the most important sections. And this year, it's all the different segments of the ummah and all the different ulama to combine the effort and put the efforts together. وَإِنَّمَا تَكَفَّلَ بِهِ الْجَامِعُونَ بَيْنَ التَّفْسِيرِ وَالْحَدِيثِ وَالْفِقْهِ وَالْأُصُولِ. They had to combine the efforts together and remove all these kind of doubts from the noble and sublime ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So here Ibn Hajar rahmallah is discussing the steps to take when we come across these narrations between which they seem to be a contradiction. What steps should we take in order to remove that contradiction, or to make us understand that there is actually no contradiction? So he explains that the first step is to look at the status of both narrations. He says, وَإِنْ عُرِضَ فَلَا يَخْلُو إِمَّا يَكُونَ مُعَارِضُهُ مَقْبُولًا. Now here take note that he's using the word مَقْبُولًا. He's not saying صَحِيحًا. So he's saying that it's مَقْبُولًا مِثْلَهُ أو يَكُونُ مَرْدُودًا. That the one which is contradicting this report, it's either a narration which is also مقبول. So maybe this is a Sahih narration and that's a Hasan narration. Because we done that Hasan narrations fall under the category of maqbul narrations. So either it's also a maqbul narration, or yakunu marduran, or it is a rejected narration. If it is a rejected narration, if it's not authentic, so you have a authentic report and then you have a weak narration which is contradicting that report. So he says, فَالثَّانِي لَا أَثَرَ لَهُ, that it doesn't harm it in the least. If that report is weak, how it cannot, it does not have any strength to oppose a strong report from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لأن القوي لا يؤثر فيه مخالفة الضعيف. That a strong narration is not impacted by a weak narration which contradicts it. So this is if it is a weak report which is contradicting a strong report, you very simply dismiss that weak report and you just follow the authentic report. But then he says, وَإِنْ كَانَتِ الْمُعَارَضَةُ بِمِثْلِهِ فَلَا يَخْلُو إِمَّا أَن يُمْكِنَ الْجَمْعُ بَيْنَ مَدْلُولَيْهِمَا بِغَيْرِ تَعَسُّفٍ أَوْ لَا. That if both of them are of equal status, then we will have to focus more on the narrations and see how we can avert any apparent contradiction. So he explains that the first step which we will take is that إِمَّا أَن يُمْكِنَ الْجَمْعُ بَيْنَ مَدْلُولَيْهِمَا بِغَيْرِ تَعَسُّفٍ. He's saying that we'll see if we can combine the two reports, but he says بِغَيْرِ تَعَسُّفٍ, that we should do this here without making ta'assuf, and we will explain what is ta'assuf. For now, just understand that he's saying that we should try to combine the two reports. Now here when he says بِمِثْلِهِ, so Allama Qasim rahmallah quotes his explanation. Ibn Hajar rahmallah, when he was teaching the kitab, then what he mentioned, he said, Al-muradu bi asl al-qabul lat-tasawi fihi hatta yakun al-qawiyyu nasikhan lil-aqwa bal al-hasan yakun nasikhan lis-sahih liwujudi asl al-qabul. What he's saying? He's saying that when he's mentioned, and when he wrote here in his book, that it could be contradicted by something which is similar, then focus on that word maqbul. It can be any narration which is Hasan, whether it just made it to be Hasan, or whether it is a Hasan that is close to Sahih, or whether it is even a Sahih narration. If you have a report which is Maqbul, which is contradicted by another report which is Maqbul, so a narration which is Sahih or Hasan which is contradicted by a narration which is Sahih or Hasan, then we will have to see if we can combine the two. So he's saying that sometimes you can get a narration which is Hasan, but it contradicts a narration which is Sahih, and we're actually giving preference to that narration which is Hasan, because he's saying that you can get a Hasan narration which abrogates a narration which is Sahih. So on that point, then Allama Qasim rahimahullah said, في هذا مخالفة لما تقدم أعلاه من قوله تحصل فائدة تقسيم باعتبار مراتبه عند المعارضة. You look on it, first line, you remember from our last lesson we were discussing, that he's saying that the benefit of this mutaba'at and shawahid, etc., is that تصل فائدة تقسيم باعتبار معارضة مراتبه عند المعارضة. He just said that at times when there is contradiction, then you look at the martaba, you look at the status of the narration. And here he's saying that it's immaterial as long as it falls under the ambit of maqbul narrations. Then it doesn't make a difference whether it is Hasan or whether it is Sahih. A narration which is on the lowest level of maqbul can contradict a narration which is higher than it. So the thing is that as long as both of them fall under the category of maqbul narrations. So Allama Qasim rahmallah mentioned that this just contradicts what he mentioned now, but it also contradicts what he mentioned on page 62. You remember when he was talking about asahul asanid, then he said, وَالْمُعْتَمَدُ عَدَمُ الْإِطْلَاقِ لِتَرْجُمَةٍ مُعَيَّنَةٍ مِنْهَا نعم يستفاد من مجموع ما أطلق عليه الأئمة ذلك أرجحيته على ما لم يطلقوه. He's saying that you will give preference to narrations which are stronger, but here he's saying that as long as they fall under the category of maqbool narrations, it doesn't make a difference how strong they are. So this, obviously, you can see differs. And again, this here is the chapter, or this here is more the focus of fuqaha than muhaddithun, because muhaddithun, their focus, so that's why here also, if you see how he's put, the focus is on the matan. So it could even raise the objection that because to see if it's contradictory or not, you are inspecting the text of the narration. Whereas the job and the duty of a muhaddith is to rigidly confine themselves to the sanad. But what's the reason that here muhaddithun are also looking at the text of the narration? Because, like we mentioned earlier, that saving the beliefs of a person is so great that it demands the combined effort of scholars of tafsir and hadith and fiqh. We quoted Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, هو من أهم الأنواع يضطر إليه جميع الطوائف من العلماء وإنما تكفل به الجامعون بين التفسير والحديث والفقه والأصول. Now the question comes that how do we combine the two narrations? So Mullah al-Qari rahmallah says that بِالتَّأْوِيل أو تَقْيِيد أو تَخْصِيص. Either we interpret the one narration, we give explanation to it, we see which context it was, أو تَقْيِيد, or we mention that this here is specified to that person, أو تَخْصِيص, maybe it's specified to that time. For example, when they went in jihad and something was made permissible for them, now when they come back home, the concession no more remains. So maybe it was only in that context that it was made permissible for them. Then he puts the condition here and he says, min ghayri ta'assuf. So this here is a very important and essential condition, that there should not be any ta'assuf. Alama Laqani rahmallah explains the word asaf and says, ta'assuf, he says, وَأَصْلُهُ مِنَ الْعَصَفِ وهو الأخذ على غير الطريق كأن الخارج عن تلك القوانين مشى في غير طريقه وهو في غاية الوضوح. To put it in our context, is like the freeway, the highway, all 6 lanes, all 7 lanes are absolutely empty, and you go and you drive your car on the pavement. That's how you put it in our context, that you are going off track in spite of it being simple for you to keep on track. That is the meaning of ta'assuf. So you're going completely off track. So Mullah al-Qari rahmallah then explains that ta'assuf is even going beyond takalluf. In takalluf, you are just trying to hold onto a grass straw and see if you can make any tatbiq between the different narrations. But ta'assuf is now you're coming with something which is absolutely far-fetched. You are going totally offline. So he says, أَزْيَنُ مِنَ التَّكَلُّفِ لِأَنَّهُ خُرُوجٌ عَنِ الْجَادَةِ. That ta'assuf, you are going off track completely. You bring in some interpretation which has nothing to do with this report, and you are trying to combine the two. So obviously, as we mentioned in the beginning, that the words of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam do not contradict each other, they complement each other. So we don't have to come with such far-fetched and absurd type of interpretations to harmonize the different reports. Rather, we go to the next step, which Ibn Hajar rahmallah will mention on the next page. That not all reports, and we admit to it, it's not a fault. We admit that there are reports which you cannot combine. So we don't have to then go on to such far-fetched kind of interpretations. So Allama Qasim rahmallah says that the author clarified why he put this clause. He says, لأن ما كان بتعسف فللخصم أن يرده وينتقل إلى ما بعده من المراتب. He's saying that even if you're going to just try to clench onto a straw and come with these kind of really weird interpretations, then anyone will be able to just dismiss your interpretation. So this here is such a crucial condition that if the only way of combining the two reports is with ta'assuf, is with trying to give some far kind of interpretation, then you do not combine the reports. Rather, you go to the next step, in dealing with this kind of narrations. So Kamal bin Abi Sharif said, قوله بغير تعسف تنبيه على أنه إذا لم يمكن الجمع إلا بتعسف انتقلنا إلى ما بعد الجمع فنظرنا في التاريخ ثم في الترجيح. Likewise, Ibn al-Hanbali rahmallah also supported this in Al-Far' al-Athis. He says that if the only way you can combine the two reports, combining the two reports demand that you have to come with some far-fetched interpretation, then you don't combine the two reports, rather you look at the next step. He says, وَإِنَّمَا قُلْنَا بِغَيْرِ تَعَسُّفٍ the reason we said بغير تعسف تنبيها على أنه إذا لم يمكن الجمع إلا بتعسف انتقلنا إلى بعد الجمع. So now the question then arises that how do we know that there is no ta'assuf? How do we know that we are not giving a very far-fetched interpretation, or we are coming up with something here which is not linked to the report? So the answer to that, Alam al-Qani rahmallah explains it by saying بأن يكون موافقا للقوانين اللغوية أو الشرعية أو العقلية بحيث لا يخالف القواطع منها. That in short, there mustn't be there should be a scope for the interpretation which you are giving. There should be scope for it from an Islamic point, or at least linguistically, or even logically. It should not go against any of the known principles of Sharia, and there should be some evidence for it. It cannot just be an assumption. So in our last lesson on Muqaddamah ibn Salah on Tuesday, we done the narrations of Umar radiallahu anhu where he broke a vow. The one narration says that he took a vow to spend one night in itikaf. Another authentic narration says that he took a vow to spend one day in itikaf. So Imam Nawawi rahmallah tried to combine the two narrations by saying that maybe he took two vows. The one vow was to spend one day in itikaf, and the other vow was to spend one night in itikaf. But Allama Alai rahimahullah then refuted that and said that وفي هذا الحمل نظر لا يخفى لأنه من البعيد ألا يفهم عمر رضي الله عنه من الإذن بالوفاء بنذر اليوم الوفاء بنذر الآخر حتى يسأل عنه مرة أخرى لا سيما والواقع في أيام يسيرة يبعد النسيان فيها جدا لأن في كل من الروايات أن ذلك كان في أيام تفرقة الصبي عقب وقعة حنين. ففي هذا الحمل من أجل تحسين الظن بالرواة يترك الخلل إلى عمر رضي الله عنه إما بالنسيان في المدة اليسيرة أو بأن يخفى عليه إلحاق اليوم بالليلة في حكم الوفاة بنذره في الاعتكاف. That it's clear that Umar radiallahu anhu asked this question at the time when they were discussing what to do with the prisoners of the time of Hunain. So it's very far-fetched that Umar radiallahu anhu would ask with regards to one night, and then he would forget the ruling that he would have to go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and ask with regards to a day, etc. So therefore, it should not be something like that where there is ta'assuf. Rather, it should be something which easily, an interpretation which any person can easily understand and which makes sense. He says, فَإِنْ أَمْكَنَ الْجَمْعَ فَهُوَ النَّوْعُ الْمُسَمَّى مُخْتَلِفُ الْحَدِيثِ. If it is possible to combine the two reports, then this here is called مُخْتَلِفُ الْحَدِيثِ. So this word مُخْتَلِف, it can be read with a kasra, مُخْتَلِف, meaning مُخْتَلِف مَدْلُولِ حَدِيثِهِ. Or it can be read with a fatha as مُخْتَلَف. So in that case, it will be a masdar mimi. Or you can, to make it easier, you can maybe simply take one as the ism fa'il. Mukhtaliful hadith is the ism fa'il, and mukhtalaful hadith is the ism maf'ul. But nevertheless, you can read it in either way. So if you look here in the footnotes, Sheikh Nuruddin Itr rahmallah says that this refers to mushkilul hadith. So, is mushkilul hadith and mukhtaliful hadith the same, or do they differ? Abu Shuhba, he explained this here in detail, whether mushkilul hadith and mukhtaliful hadith are the same or whether they differ. And the conclusion is that both terms can be used for this chapter. So therefore, on the next page, when we're doing the various kitabs, when we're going to discuss, you can see وَصَنَّفَ فِي بَعْدَ ibn Qutayba wa Tahawi wa ghayruhuma. Then you will see that some scholars, when they wrote books in this on this topic, then they gave the title to their book using the word ikhtilaf or mukhtalaf. And others, when they wrote on this topic, they used the word mushkil. So we'll discuss that when we come there. Then Ibn Hajar rahmallah now brings an example to show two narrations. And this is actually not two different narrations. It's two different parts of one narration which seems to contradict each other, but it's so simple to combine. So he says, وَمَثَّلَ لَهُ نُصَّلَاحَ بِحَدِيث. Now here he is quoting the example of Ibn Salah rahimahullah. He's saying that Ibn Salah rahimahullah gave the example. So here when he's quoting Ibn Salah rahimahullah, then this here gives a subtle indication that there are so few reports like this here which seemingly contradict each other that I cannot even find another example. Rather, I will just take from those who came before me, from my predecessors, the example which they gave. Because if there was another example which he could have thought of, then he would have mentioned that example. Nevertheless, he says, وَمَثَّلَ لَهُ ابْنُ الصَّلَاحِ فِي حَدِيثٍ لَا عَدْوَى وَلَا طِيَارَةَ مع حديث فر من المجذوم فرارك من الأسد وكلاهما في الصحيح وظاهرهما التعارض. This here is such a narration which became so much quoted now during the pandemic, and such a debated narration. You have those who are for precautions and those who are against precautions. They're all quoting this very same narration as support. And therefore, you must have heard about it, and you must have heard there's over 16 different explanations for this narration. But nevertheless, here we'll just stick to what Ibn Hajar rahmallah is trying to explain. That you have this narration, like we said, it's two portions of one narration, because in the one portion of this narration, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying there is no contagion. Nothing transfers from one person to another person. But then in the ending of that very same report, he is saying that flee from a person who is suffering from leprosy, just as you would flee from a lion. So you can imagine how a person would run for his life if he has to ever come face to face with a lion. A person will run even if he has to see a puppy, a dog. So you can imagine even more if he has to see a lion. So now this here seemingly contradicts, because if Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is telling you that there is no such thing as there is no contagion, then why run away from a leper? Because his sickness will not be transferred onto you. So like we said, it's both portions are from one hadith, because the full narration, Imam Bukhari rahmallah narrates it, Babul Juzam, and he says, وَقَالَ عَفَّانِ. There's a whole discussion which we done in Muqaddamah Ibn Salam, and he uses the word وَقَال from his teachers. وقال عفان حدثنا سليم بن حيان قال حدثنا سعيد بن ميناء قال سمعت أبا هريرة رضي الله عنه يقول قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا عدوى ولا طيار ولا هام ولا سفر وفر من المجذوم كما تفر من الأسد. You can see both are part of one and the same report. So very briefly to explain the narration, the word tiyarata is used, it's derived from the word tayr, which means a bird, because prior to Islam, the people of Arabia, they would make decisions based on the direction in which a bird flies. So this narration negates that if the bird flies to the left, it means there'll be bad luck in what you are going to do. But it's not only confined to birds. وَالتَّشَاؤُمْ قَدْ يَكُونْ بِغَيْرِ الطَّيْرِ كَمُقَابَلَةِ الكلب أو حمار أو كافر أو فاجر. You know, in our times it could also apply that so often people will ask that if a black cat has to walk in front of you, then does that have any significance? Does it mean that there will be bad luck? So obviously this narration contradicts all of that. وقد يكون بالقول كما إذا سمع يا حيران أو لفظ الشر أو نفخ خير. If someone has to talk something in a negative, then a person might feel that he will get bad luck. So this narration negates all of that. And then he explains the next portion is So it's, the first is la adwa, that there is no contagion. Then wala tira, wala hamma. So Mullah al-Qari and Ulama Qurani, they explain hamma is min tayr al-layl. Actually, Ulama Qurani takes it from Mullah al-Qari, min tayr al-layl. So an owl. So what would happen is that Arabs would take a bad omen from owls. Or that's the one meaning. And the other meaning is that they would believe that when a person dies, then either a bird emanates from that, when a person is killed, then either a bird emanates from that person who is killed, or that person is transformed himself and he becomes into a bird, and then it goes out and cries for revenge. So every time you hear the birds outside, the bird is crying for revenge. And only after you take revenge, then that soul can rest in peace. So that's the meaning of hamma. And then for safar, again, there are different meanings. The one is da'un fil batni, yasfarru minhu al-waja', that a person gets a illness in the stomach, and because of that his entire face goes pale. يعتقدون أنه يعدي, they would feel that that kind of a sickness was contagious and it would transfer. So that's the one. More than even a sickness, they would وكانوا يزعمون أن سفر حية في البطن والذي يجد الإنسان عند جوعه من عضه. They would believe that there's a snake in the stomach. So obviously all that are baseless beliefs. That's the one meaning of safar. And the second meaning of safar is that they would believe that the second month on the lunar calendar, the month of safar, is a month of bad luck and of evil. They wouldn't let their daughters get married in that month. They wouldn't embark on a journey in that month. They wouldn't start new trade, because it would mean it is they would think that it's a month of bad luck. So now this here seems contradictory with the remaining portion, وَفِرَّ مِنَ الْمَجْذُومِ كَمَا تَفِرُّ مِنَ الْأَسَدِ. So inshallah, in the next lesson we'll explain how you can combine these narrations and there is no real contradiction. Inshallah, we'll discuss it on Saturday. Jazakallahu khairan.